Today we are doing I'm doing another dialogue with Della Burton. Today's topic is boy mechanics, or why men are susceptible to submitting to threat narratives, why men seem to want to take an identity from serving threat narratives. To start, I'll give a little bit of the relevant background on threat narratives. Threat narratives establish the sense of belonging of a group. A threat narrative decides who's within a group and who's outside of a group. And the people who control the threat narrative establish a sense of belonging in the group. In other words, the people who control the threat narratives belong to the group, and in order for people who do not innately belong to the group, if they benefit the people who are seen to control the belonging of the group, they belong, they've earned their belonging. If they don't benefit them, then they're seen as fools or idiots, or alternatively, if they don't benefit them or cause harm to the people who are the center of the group, who establish the belonging of the group, they are villains and are exiled from the group or fought against in the case of enemies. So the key idea here is that the threat narrative divides those who belong from those who must earn belonging. And those who must earn belonging must benefit those who belong.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that kind of explains why just about anybody would want to develop their identity through a threat narrative if they were considered to be outside the group, if they were not considered to be, just by virtue of their birth, a part of the group. They'd want something to earn their place in that group.
Or by virtue of their birth, valued by the group.
Right.
Like, by virtue of their birth, given a sense of value and of worth. Like, you don't have to do anything to earn this value and worth, you just have it. The group has decided this particular subgroup just has worth by virtue of existing. And it's sort of a situation where all groups that last for any length of time seem to have this. Some people have value within the group by virtue of birth, and other people have to earn that value by serving the people who have value by virtue of birth. And you can see that play out multiple times throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
And with the Ottoman Empire, which I covered in previous videos, and just to do a summary of that, the Ottoman Empire essentially created two social groups. The native Muslims, who had a sense of belonging just by birth, and the Janissaries, who essentially had their sense of belonging stripped from them when they were taken from their families. They were the sons of Christian slaves, and they were taken from their families. They were forced marched hundreds of miles, and then the ones who survived were forcibly inducted into Islam. They were brainwashed into Islam. So this whole process created two groups of people. This is simplified, of course. The society itself was more complicated than this, but this is a simplified model. It created a group of people who had an innate identity that was consistent, continuous, from birth to death. They were Muslim. And then they had this other group that had their identity that they were born with stripped from them, so that their sense of belonging was stripped from them. And then they were inducted into this service to the state. And this whole process of having their sense of belonging stripped from them gave them a powerful motive to try to find another sense of belonging. And when you do that to someone, when you strip away their sense of belonging, they sort of default on this idea that they have to earn it back somehow. So what's happening in that situation, to just focus in on the mechanics of it, the psychological mechanics of it, is you have a situation where you have a kid who's being torn from his family. Now, on a subconscious level where there is no real, adult rationalizations, he's simply been abandoned by his family. And you can see that even in the context of the situation. In many cases, those slaves that didn't fight back would be the ones who would get their sons taken. So they would submit to this, which to a kid looks like abandonment, right?
Right.
And even on a subconscious level, you don't know really the context. All you know is that your emotional system is now gone, which is abandonment. So as you grow up after having experienced that kind of abandonment, it's a situation where you have to develop coping mechanisms because you have created something that, an injury that you now have to compensate for. And the way that these kids would compensate is that they would say, well, I wasn't really abandoned. Either my parents were inferior or I was inferior. And the way they do that is by focusing on this belonging through achievement.
So they feel like they were abandoned because they weren't good enough.
Yeah.
Because they hadn't done anything yet.
When you're abandoned, it creates a wound. And there's several ways to deal with that. A healthy way is just to actually process the sense of abandonment and just acknowledge it, even if it doesn't make any sense at all, any logical sense, or you can say, well, my parents didn't mean to do this, they couldn't stop it. But just to recognize that the abandonment exists. Mm-hmm. Another way to deal with it, which is less healthy, is to essentially create a narrative for yourself that your parents really didn't abandon you. Either they were inferior and you abandoned them because they were inferior, and somehow you flip it around and say, well, they weren't worth it. They weren't really meaningful to me. So they didn't really abandon me. I abandoned them. I had no worth with them. Or you say you were abandoned because it was your fault. You were inferior. And you have to somehow make up for that inferiority through achievement. And both ways sort of take that helplessness of being abandoned and give the illusion to the person that they actually were in control of the abandonment. Because that's the other thing. You become obsessed with this idea of preventing that situation from happening again. So you grab onto the idea that you actually have some control over having that situation happen again. And this belonging through achievement gives you that sense of control. I achieve, I belong. I control my achievements, supposedly. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So what ego is, this is where ego comes in, is this sort of coping mechanism to deal with that sense of abandonment. So you start to want to feed your ego your sense of achievement, of sense of outward value, because that's where you get your belonging from. As long as I have these gold stars pinned on my chest, I belong.
Right.
But what it really is, it's a way of feeling in control over your sense of belonging. If you can control your sense of belonging, if you can control whether or not you belong by achievement, by achieving, you can prevent being abandoned again. Or at least that's the theory. This really doesn't actually solve the initial injury, it just masks it. And the reality is that the sense of abandonment will grow with the sense of your achievement. Because you can never earn back belonging you didn't need to have to earn. And in that sense, every achievement, every time you earn belonging through achievement, you feed the belief that you're innately unworthy, that you have to earn belonging through achievement. And you also feed the belief that people only care about you because of your achievement. And because the injury is never addressed, you're still, in a lot of ways, in that emotional map that's inside of us, you're still there. You're still at that spot, interpreting the world through that particular lens. So when you have all of this achievement, you've achieved all of these things. Now it's not just the little boy who was abandoned. It was the man with all the gold stars who was abandoned. And it's an even greater abandonment. Because, wow, I've achieved all this and I was still abandoned. So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So inevitably, this solution is no solution, because what it ends up happening is you end up with men dragging this ego around, and they're actually feeding this initial abandonment instead of addressing it. They're feeding it bigger. So the ego becomes almost like a paralysis of their psyche, and they're dragging it around, constantly feeding it, when it's only making things worse. And so that's sort of the situation that I think that the Janissaries found themselves in. They would achieve in order to feed this never-ending hunger, and in feeding this never-ending hunger, it just made the hunger bigger. And, of course, the Sultan was there, the Ottoman Empire was there, to provide for them the structure to achieve, to feed the hunger of abandonment. So they created this entire structure in which they could feed their hunger for achievement, achieve belonging through achievement. And I think that is what's happening to men. And I'm not sure how long it's been happening to men, but I'm certainly sure that it's happening to them now. Is that we have created a structure, an entire social structure for men to feed their sense of abandonment by achieving.
I mean, I can see that because when you look at the way society is shaped around achievement by men, everything that gets accomplished in society depends upon men having that hunger to achieve, and it really is men, because if it were both sexes doing this, and I know there are ways in which overall women have the same issue, but it's not done in the same way, because we have an out. Mm-hmm. You know, it's acceptable for us to say, well, I just want to stay home with the kids. Mm-hmm. And people don't look at us like, oh, you lazy bum. What do you mean you just want to stay home with the kids? It's normal. We can do that. Mm-hmm. As soon as a guy does that, he's an outcast. He's weird. There's something wrong with his choice. He's just a deadbeat that doesn't want to do a job and support his family. Mm-hmm. And even today, even with all of the advancements and people discussing this and it becoming more normal for there to be stay-at-home dads, even today, people will look askance at a stay-at-home dad or a dad that is out during the day with his kids and not working someplace, and especially if they know that he is the stay-at-home parent. Mm-hmm. And people look at certain achievements as being male achievements and certain achievements as not being male achievements, mm-hmm. whereas they don't really do that with women. So men are stuck in an area where they have this narrow set of achievements that these are the achievements that define whether or not you're an achieving man. Mm-hmm. And if you look to achieve in some other area, you're not doing it right.
Why is it that we see men in terms of these achievements, or actually rather men see themselves in terms of these particular achievements? They don't even allow themselves to take a sense of self-worth from something outside of these particular achievements. And it's almost like a compulsion that they have. And I'm not saying that as a negative thing against them. I think it's a situation where they are being set up psychologically to engage in this activity, and then they turn around and they marginalize men who don't. And women do it too, of course. Because, again, men's identities are taken from, in many cases, benefiting women, making sure that women are protected and provided for. That's the very definition of a man. Women marginalize men who don't engage in that. But what I wanted to really get into is, why is this the way it is? Why is it that men have this hunger for achievement, this hunger for trying to get a sense of identity from benefiting and protecting women? And through these through this sort of architecture that has been constructed for them to gain that identity. And I think it also explains why women haven't really made really big inroads into the work world in the way the feminists want. Because the work world was never really set up for the psychology of women. It was set up for the psychology of men who have this hunger to feed this ego, and who are set up in a particular psychological way. To bring it back, why is it that men are prone to this? Why is it that they have this emotional, I guess we could call it a frailty, because it seems to be that it is a handicap. Ooh, I know I'm going to get pissed off, guys, from that one.
Well, I think this is something that gets kind of thrown at them from early in life, mm-hmm. right on through their entire youth. Mm-hmm. The idea of responsibility, I think, is trained into kids differently, depending on whether the kid is a boy or a girl.
Oh, yeah.
There's some areas where, we get the same thing. If you say you're going to do something, you should do it. And, unless, somebody has bad parents that don't teach them stuff like that. But
I remember seeing in airport there was a couple with a boy and a girl, and the girl was actually older than the boy. And the father was getting the boy to carry some luggage, and the girl was like at least half a foot bigger than the boy and more developed. And yet it was the boy that the father was getting to carry the luggage, and he was encouraging him, like, here, take your identity from doing this. Take your identity from this kind of activity, serving, doing something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, in some ways it's not a bad thing, but it becomes a bad thing when that's all you can take your identity from. And it also sort of becomes a bad thing because the sister's just sitting there, she's taking her identity from existing as a girl. Well, that's really limiting as well. But what I wanted to get into with this was just what I think is going on psychologically with men and boys, and how it's actually not even a situation that's malicious. It's just something that just sort of happens. And how it sort of parallels the situation with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire did this very, I don't know if it was conscious, but it was definitely chosen that they did this. That they took boys and they stripped their sense of belonging, and then they essentially brainwashed them to Islam, and then put them in a situation where, they had this hierarchical situation where they could achieve and get a sense of belonging by serving this Islamic state. But I think what's happening with boys is something that's less artificially constructed. It's actually more fundamental to the way we raise children. And I think and it's not something that really you can pin blame on anyone. So what I think is happening is we have this, when we're really young, we have this inability to differentiate ourselves from our caretakers, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're just all one thing. And for the most part, most children's main caretaker when they're young is their mother. So we are undifferentiated from our mother. And then we begin to differentiate. We begin to understand that we are separate from her. And she becomes our source of belonging. We understand that, she's the source of pretty much life itself. She's protection. She is food. She's comfort. She's emotional comfort and everything. And in many ways, she's also our first sense that there is another that we could belong to. So she's our first sense of belonging. It's that first sense of a relationship with another being, right?
Right.
Now, what happens with boys is as they grow, there's a perception that they're different than mother, that they're a different group entirely than their mothers. Now, up to that point that they recognize that they're a different group entirely from their mothers, she's pretty much been a goddess. Like, she's controlled their entire lives and controlled almost every aspect of their entire lives and controlled everything, all of their needs and wants and whether or not they got them. So she's essentially fulfilled, in a very real sense, corporeal sense, actual sense, psychological sense, the role of a goddess. So now we have this nascent understanding of himself as being male, which is different than being female. And the god is female. The goddess is female. He's male. And what comes into that is this sense of inferiority. This feeling that he is lesser than the female because he's male, doesn't know what male is really. But it definitely isn't female, and female is life, is food, is comfort, is that initial sense of belonging, the initial sense of identity even, is related to the female. And that is sort of it's sort of the way the Ottoman Empire created this artificial abandonment. This is sort of a reverse abandonment. Mother hasn't gone anywhere, but because he's male, he no longer can identify with her or have the same kind of relationship that he had with her. It now becomes a relationship of a superior to an inferior, and in a way that he has to resolve emotionally and psychologically. And so who am I in relation to the mother goddess? And that's that sense of abandonment, that sense of not being at the same level. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I'm thinking about this, and I guess I can see where that's a distinct possibility, where suddenly discovering that you're very different from the person that you've depended on, all of your existence, would kind of be disconcerting and would make you feel that sense of not belonging, of being the outsider, the other. And it would be especially bad if you had a sibling that was female.
Mm-hmm.
But unless the mother changed the way she acted toward the child at that point, I'm not sure how it would instill a sense of abandonment.
Well, the abandonment isn't something that the mother is doing. The abandonment is almost natural outcrop of recognizing that you're different. And it's not a conscious choice. Like it's not an issue of the relationship changing in any way. The mother changes. It's the son realizing that he doesn't belong to the group that she is part of. He's developing this identity, but it isn't the same as the mother's identity. So the sense of abandonment isn't that she's actually abandoning him. It's that he has abandoned that group that she's part of. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like and it's sort of a necessary thing because it's a part of differentiation, right?
Right.
So he is moving away from that, but in a way that's because of the power differential. It's almost like he doesn't realize it's him moving away from her psychologically. It's more like she is abandoning him, right?
Okay.
And we're talking, like, kids do not understand adult rationalizations. That comes way later. They're just sort of like these emotion sponges. If the situation is like a situation where the father is part of the picture and involved, if it's a situation, for example, that there are some cultures in which fathers do a lot of the child rearing, even in infancy, and not necessarily even our culture, but other cultures. And if it's that kind of a situation, I think that the integrating the sense of self and separating from the sense of this mother goddess would be very simple. It wouldn't even be registered as an abandonment. It would just be, oh, well, I'm like the father god. Okay, that's fine. And there would still be that sense that there's an identity of equal importance and equal strength to cleave to be part of. And even if it's a situation where at this point, this psychological point where this injury happens or could happen, the father starts to cycle into view and becomes more involved, I think that would probably prevent this kind of injury from happening. But if it's a situation where the father is very distant or the father isn't there at all, then I think that is almost inevitable to be something that is a psychological pressure, a psychological sense of abandonment, of lack of belonging.
And of having to sort of earn the right to belong, earning a place by achieving then.
Yeah, but that they don't have anything to cleave to. Like when the boy realizes this and realizes that they do not have an identity of commiserate power, emotional power to the woman, to the mother, which is it's an incredibly emotionally powerful identity. The person who has controlled your life up to that point and essentially you lived and died based on her decision, right? That's the power of a god. If you don't feel like you have an identity that's equal to that, it's going to be painful. It's going to give a sense of inferiority. It's going to feel a sense of abandonment. It's going to, it's going to be a scar. And if there is a father in the picture, then, it'll just be like, oh, okay, well, I'm like him. I have an identity. And if he's been very involved in the rearing, then there won't be any problem because the boy will have already associated very strongly, made the very strong emotional association between masculinity and all of those needs that he got met by his father, right?
Right.
Like the intimacy, the emotional needs, the feeding, the physical comfort, the hygiene. If his father's been meeting those needs, he's also going to be perceived emotionally as a god by the child. And so his identity it's not going to be a really painful identity crisis. It's just going to be, oh, okay. keep moving along. But if there isn't the father there in a very powerful way, then the identity crisis is going to be extremely painful. And the wound is going to be probably proportionate to the distance the father is. Now, if the father cycles into view at this point, then it probably won't be as bad as I'm making it out to be, because the son will simply say, these are the aspects that my father is giving me. And it's not rational. It's not on a rational level. This is a subconscious. My father is giving me these emotional things. And this is good. This is my identity, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it kind of sounds like that makes, really, when the injury does happen, that makes it centered around the female.
Yes.
That it's not just a sense of not belonging. It's a sense of not belonging related to where the female is the one who belongs and the male is the one who does not.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very simple. And it's really nobody's fault. Because the reality is that, there's no way a mother can stop that from happening to a son. And it's something that it's subtle enough that people probably wouldn't recognize it or realize it, that it's going on a large scale in a society. And just to give some evidence that this may be actually factual, those societies in which fathers are very highly involved in the rearing of children tend to not be as patriarchal. So they don't have these enormous hierarchies of guys fighting for recognition, fighting to feed the ego. They tend to be not as motivated to feed that sense of lack of belonging through achievement. And there isn't as much violence when fathers are very involved, because there isn't as much of a sense of competition between men, because they have, like, the guys in these cultures where fathers are very involved, they have a sense of an identity. So what happens is, what I'm theorizing happens is the societies in which men are highly involved in the raising of boys, even from the very beginning. And again, they don't tend to be as patriarchal. They don't tend to be as violent. They don't tend to be as patriarchal. I think what's happening is boys don't have that kind of an identity crisis that's fueling their desire for achievement. And in some cases, the desire for achievement comes out in violence. I mean, if you look at the ghettos, there's no real opportunity for financial achievement, but a boy can actually get status by killing another boy or young man. He can improve his sexual prospects by doing that, and his sense of belonging and respect within the community. So that's why we see that these kind of incredibly aggressive competitions between men to achieve a sense of value. And if you look at the Janissaries, they perpetuated a murder against their own people in order to achieve within this context of the Turkish society, like to achieve this. They were feeding their ego by murdering other Christians. And it's the same situation here. We have boys who are trying to feed that identity crisis, that sense that they don't have a sense of belonging, they don't have respect, they don't have an equal identity, by murdering each other. And it really is tied to how much investment men give in their offspring. Lots of investment. You get boys who are highly balanced, emotionally balanced. And it's not that they don't achieve; they're just more balanced about it. And they're more capable of balancing achievement with personal needs and personal goals. So
they're more inspired instead of driven.
Yeah, more inspired instead of driven. And also, I think, possibly more flexible in their inspiration. So possibly even more capable of achieving. Because when you're feeding your ego, you sort of have to keep to what everybody else thinks is good, right? Everybody else is going to give you a pat on the head for. Whereas if you don't, then you can go wherever your inspiration takes you. But so this is sort of what I'm saying. I'm saying that this this sense of abandonment. So actually, in reality, it's not really abandonment by the mother figure. It's really abandonment by the father. They haven't stepped in and fulfilled that psychological role of showing, not telling, but showing a young boy their value. And by showing the young child, the young boy, their father's value, the father is actually showing the boy his own value. And he's demonstrating it by tying his masculine presence to provision of the young boy's needs.
Mm-hmm.
So that there's that emotional tie, and that's emotions are really where we understand our sense of self and other, and in many ways our sense of God, or divinity, if you want to call it that. And at the emotional level is where we get a sense of the power of things. So when a man takes care of his son and takes care of his son's needs, he is actually creating in his son a powerful self, a powerful sense of himself as male, and a sense of the power of the masculine. And so he creates a boy who doesn't necessarily, or he creates a boy or a young man who doesn't necessarily have an answer to what a man is, but more is not really that interested in asking the question.
He doesn't have to necessarily have everybody else's approval on a fundamental level to decide who he is.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily like he has an answer, that his father's given him an answer to what a man is. His father's actually given him a way of not being too worried about the answer, or not being too worried about asking the question. So that's sort of why I think that men in a lot of cases are really drawn to threat narratives. And I think there's more complexity to that too. I mean, there are other situations that sort of reinforce this. And again, it's not a situation where, I mean, you can't really blame anybody for something like that. In many cases, the patriarchal societies are societies in which there is not a lot of resources. So there are a lot of people running after very few resources, or the environment is incredibly harsh. So to eke out a living, you really need a group of people who will sacrifice themselves physically in service of an identity, who will do anything to get approval, to get that sense of
achievement and
belonging. So you really need that kind of patriarchy to just even survive in that kind of an environment. So it's just an adaptation, really. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's an adaptation thing. And really, nobody's to blame for it. Nobody's to really blame for the fact that guys become, through this process, they become vulnerable to wanting to achieve, to wanting to get belonging through achievement. And thus they become vulnerable to being exploited for that. I mean, because it really is an exploitation of this vulnerability in young men, that they often aren't given the emotional tools to deal with this identity crisis when it happens, when they differentiate from their mother.
Well, I think as far as there being no one to blame for it, I think most of the time you're probably right on that. There's no one to blame for it, as in nobody did this on purpose. Mm-hmm. Nobody specifically set out and said, well, we're going to create an identity crisis for little boys so that they'll serve us. Mm-hmm. But there is dysfunction in today's society that exacerbates this problem.
Oh, yeah.
The whole tendency of society to place children with the mothers following things like divorce, women choosing to be single moms in the first place. And in fact, in the last census in the United States, they found that there were more single moms who had chosen to be single moms that were never married than there were single moms who were single moms because they got divorced. Mm-hmm. And in a single mom situation like that, we're talking about a baby who is raised in a household without a dad. Mm-hmm. And in some situations doesn't get any kind of visitation or any input at all from dad. Mm-hmm. And there are organizations, the Heritage Foundation is one of them, that has done research on this and has found that there's a great deal of dysfunction that comes out of this for children of both sexes. That they're more likely as they get older to have the kind of dysfunction in their life that leads them to get into trouble with the law, that leads them to in turn become unwed parents. They drop out of school more likely or more often, and don't continue on to higher education. They have more difficulty in their jobs. All of these things stem from being deprived of having their father in their lives. And in the impact on boys, if what you're talking about is correct, the impact on boys is going to be even bigger, simply because not only do they not have that guidance, and they don't have the example of how dad does things as opposed to how mom does things, they also don't have their identity formed the way that it should form as in when they're children.
Yeah. Well, I think that I don't know if we can say that the impact on boys is worse, because I really haven't gotten into the impact on girls. This was just on boys today. But and I think that the impact on girls is actually also really bad. But yeah, it's this situation is sort of deplorable, and it really does hit boys hard. I'm not going to say more or less, but it does hit boys hard. And if I'm correct, it hits them in the inability to make a connection, this emotional connection between masculinity and having their needs met, having their comfort needs met, having their physical needs met. And that this is actually really vital. And the reality is that I think the dysfunction, in my model, the dysfunction probably started before this wave of divorces and single mothers. It started with the Industrial Revolution and the father out of the home. That's when it really started to multiply.
And that would make a big difference, because prior to that, instead of somebody going off to work in an industrial complex, in a factory, in a sales floor, anything like that, it was all family businesses, and or at least mostly family businesses, and your business was in your home, or your family ran your business out of a building. Yes. You didn't leave your kids and go to work. Your kids were there when you worked.
Yeah, and the family was helping everyone do their job. It was a much more integrated system, and men would have had a lot more time with their children. In fact, I read some literature that suggests that men were highly involved prior to the Industrial Revolution. Men were highly involved in the raising of their children, and in particular, the education of their children. And
that's another thing that's changed significantly. We send kids to public and private school systems instead of educating them at home, and they're starting earlier.
Yeah, and it really and also if you look at it in terms of forced abandonment, these kinds of situations may not be particularly healthy for children.
It's actually probably not the best thing to send your child to school as young as you possibly can. Yeah. And you look at a lot of families in modern America. You've got, before they go to kindergarten, the kid has to go to preschool, and sometimes before they go to preschool, they're in daycare. And there's daycare for infants now. So if you have both mom and dad working, or you have a single mom situation where mom receives daycare or pays for daycare, the baby isn't with either parent, or the child isn't with either parent. And most of the workers in daycare situations and most of the teachers in preschools and elementary schools are women. Yeah. So they're going to be completely without any kind of male influence.
The reality is that when a boy realizes that he is a boy, and that the mother goddess is his identity he doesn't have the emotional potency of the mother goddess as a boy. He doesn't even know what a boy is, right?
Right.
He doesn't know the value of a boy. He doesn't know the relation. And we're just talking about a pure situation where the only caretaker is a woman. His identity is completely rootless. It's completely, it doesn't really exist. And there's nothing to anchor it to. It's completely, and so what ends up happening is he anchors it to his mother, of course. So he becomes either the entity that is served by this woman or the entity that serves this woman, right? So he anchors it to her. And you can see how different kinds of dysfunctions would spiral out of that.
Yeah, definitely.
But always at the root of it is this inferiority. And in some cultures, like, I don't know how to describe this except to say that I think these mothers must be trolling their sons. The way they will resolve this identity crisis in the boy is the mother will say, boys are meant to be superior to women. And can you imagine the kind of mindfuck that is? At that point in time, emotionally, women have this incredible potency that is related, like it can only be described as being a god. And then you're being told that your identity is based on becoming superior to a god.
Yeah, that would be a mindfuck.
That sounds like the perfect troll. It's like, anyway, but in many cases they're, I don't think they realize what they're doing, really. But it's like, dude, that's really, anyway. But other cultures, there's various ways of dealing with this identity crisis that are more or less healthy. Probably the healthiest would just be give the kid his damn father. But but there's other ways. They deal with it by initiating boys when they're 12 or 13, or they go through puberty, to give them a sense of being part of a male culture. And it's interesting because those initiations, I know a lot of people focus on the endurance that the boy goes through. But if you really think about it, what's happening during those initiations is he has to trust this male culture that he's being inducted into. And it's this incredible display of vulnerability. And vulnerability has this ability of binding people together. When people go through an extremely stressful situation, for example, if there's people who go through a plane crash and they survive, a lot of the times they're bonded together through this incredibly stressful experience. And they're bonded together because they've exchanged this incredible experience of vulnerability. So when this boy is brought into this male society, he's put through this ritual of vulnerability and trust of these men. So he's actually creating this relationship to these men psychologically. And so, I mean, that's one way that cultures deal with this identity crisis that boys have. And then the other ways are just this much more intimate relationship between boys and men and growing up and all of that, which is probably a lot healthier than what we're seeing in our society. But I was going to go into what's happening with girls. Now, when the boy is having this identity crisis and he's saying to himself, not saying to himself, but on a subconscious level, here is the mother goddess. What am I? I am inferior to this emotional potency that's been laid down in my subconscious. The girl, at the same time, and we're just talking about a boy and a girl with only the mother, the girl is experiencing an opposite situation that is just as toxic. What she realizes when she realizes that she is the same as this mother goddess, and she comes to the realization that who she is as a separate person, separate from the mother goddess, will never be more important than being female.
Life becomes all about being female.
Yes.
And rather than just being.
Yeah, it becomes that becomes all encompassing. Her only real effective self is being female. That's it. Her personhood will never be more important than her womanhood. And unless there is a father there to balance that out, that's going to constrain and limit her throughout her entire life. So what you'll end up seeing is these girls who are just raised by mothers, they're going to be constrained and limited to just being female. So what are they going to do immediately, as soon as possible? They're going to start engaging in the most female acts that they can. So why are they giving birth at 11, 12, or hell, even 9? Because they're entirely constrained and by being female. That's all they are, is female.
It also would lead to using the same kind of toxic feminine traits, or displaying the same kind of toxic feminine traits in sort of establishing a group, establishing their own community within, their group of peers. They couldn't establish, say, a pecking order, or, for something a little nicer, just who is who within the group, without competing with each other for who is the most feminine, who's the most female, and who's the most stereotypically female, based on the societal view of what female is.
Well, when you're constrained, when your identity is entirely defined in being female, then the only way that you have sort of an effective presence or a sense of self, or any idea of affecting your environment, is through your femaleness, which means you're either emphasizing your value or you're emphasizing your vulnerability. And when you have women in a group who are all thinking the same way, that, it's like it sets women, this whole situation sets them at odds. And
right.
Somebody is going to end up looking or seeming more feminine or more whatever, more vulnerable, more beautiful than someone else.
And it kind of eliminates almost the entire gamut of human capability.
Yep.
You'd have to be... This explains a lot about what I suffered in high school. So my whole identity as a person was built on not so much what I could achieve, but how I could figure myself out and be the best of what I could be, not just being female, but when I went to my class reunion, my last class reunion that I went to, I took my camera so everybody would be sure to recognize me, because I wasn't sure they'd know who I was without it. I was, involved in sports. I was involved in all kinds of different activities. It wasn't so much my seeking of approval within society, but my seeking of a place within my community that was my school. Was more in the things that I did, rather than I'm a girl, look at me. And of course, that pretty much put me on the margins of every group. And I was involved with every group in my school, every single clique. I can't really name a clique in my school that I didn't do something with. But I was on the edges of every single one of them. Yeah. And yeah, it was that very thing. The other girls were competing. A lot of the other girls were competing for who could be the girliest.
Who could be,
who could be the most female.
Who could be the most beautiful.
Who could be the most beautiful, who could be the most vulnerable.
But who could be...
And it wasn't entirely that way. I mean, we had athletes that competed for who could be the best at what they did. But a lot of that competition was in, look how I have to struggle for this.
So it was an emphasis on the vulnerability.
But we also, you could look at the difference between a lot of the students. See, I grew up in a small town. There were a lot of students whose families were more like the old-fashioned, the family business. Maybe wasn't in the home, but the whole family was involved in it. And sometimes the family business was a farm. And so both parents were at home. And some of our best athletes, some of our highest achieving girls in the school really came from families like that. Not not the family that is the modern, mom and dad both go to work someplace, and the kid has a babysitter after, has some sort of daycare after school. But where both parents were intimately involved with the child rearing and the guidance that the child received.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not surprised, but the thing is that what I wanted to point out is that in these different cliques, women will compete to be the most beautiful in the context of beauty for that clique.
Yes. And there was something very different with that too. I mean, and my school didn't have necessarily distinct lines between the cliques, but for instance, you had the preppies. You had to have penny loafers. If you didn't have penny loafers, you weren't dressed like a preppy. If you were a skater, you had to have skids, or you weren't dressed like a skater. I think I had mentioned that on Honey Badger Radio, the way each clique had almost a uniform.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned it in the previous episode of the dialogues. But yeah, it's like they establish these little territories, and then they compete within the territory for the one who most embodies the beauty of that particular subgroup.
Yeah,
and it's interesting how that all forms, and I think so. I think that actually, just to get back into what I was saying before, I think that it really does affect girls. It limits them when they don't have a male caretaker, because if they did have a male caretaker, if they did have a father in their lives who had established that emotional connection between masculinity and that potent emotional masculinity is what maybe I should refer to it. Essentially, the connection between provision of the girl's needs, early needs, and the adult masculinity. That potent emotional connection. If a girl has that, then when she recognizes that she's female, there's still this antipode that there is a mystery, a sense that there's something outside of the mother goddess. So I think maybe that's where to end off. For me, I think there's a lot more to talk about, but I'll see how people respond to this.
Okay.
And what their questions are, and if they understand it, or if they get really offended, or what happens. So anyway, I'll just call it a day.
Sounds good.
This has been Dialogues with Typhon Blue and Della Burton.